There's a frustrating pattern you've probably seen in your own life more than once. You start something with energy, clear intention, a sense that this time will be different. You feel focused, motivated, almost certain that you're finally moving in the right direction. And for a few days, maybe even a few weeks, everything holds. Then something shifts. Not dramatically, not because you suddenly stopped caring, just a small break in rhythm, a day where you don't feel like it, a moment where something else feels easier, a delay that seems harmless at the time. And before you fully notice what's happening, the structure you were building starts slipping. You tell yourself you'll get back to it, but you don't. Or you do, but not the same way. And after a while, you're not just starting again, you're starting over. That cycle is more common than most people admit. Not because people are lazy, and not because they don't want change badly enough, but because they rely on something that was never meant to carry long-term change. Motivation. Motivation is powerful in the beginning. It gets you moving. It creates clarity. It gives you a temporary surge that makes everything feel possible, but it is unstable by nature. It rises quickly and it fades just as quickly. And if your progress depends on it, your progress becomes just as unstable. That's where consistency begins to matter in a completely different way. Not as a productivity trick, not as a discipline cliché, but as the only thing that remains when motivation disappears. Because at some point, every path becomes repetitive. Every goal becomes less exciting. Every effort becomes harder to feel in the moment. And in those exact moments, the difference between people who move forward and people who keep restarting becomes very clear. One group waits to feel ready again. The other keeps going, even when nothing about the moment feels supportive. And over time, that quiet difference begins to compound into something much larger than it looks at the beginning. This episode is about that difference. Not about pushing yourself harder, and not about forcing constant intensity, but about understanding why consistency changes the structure of your life itself. Why small, repeated actions become more powerful than rare bursts of effort. Why staying in motion, even slowly, builds something that starting fast never can. Because once you see this clearly, you start realizing something simple. Your problem was never starting. It was stopping. So before anything else, we need to begin with the smallest part of this idea, the one most people underestimate. How small actions, repeated long enough, quietly turn into results that don't look small at all. Small actions compound into life-changing results. One of the biggest reasons people underestimate consistency is that the early stages of progress rarely look impressive. The action feels too small, too ordinary, too easy to dismiss. You read a few pages, write a paragraph, take the walk, do the workout, save the money, sit with the task a little longer than yesterday. Nothing about it seems dramatic enough to justify the hope you place in it. And that's exactly why so many people abandon the process too early. They look at the effort and compare it to the size of the life they want to build, and the distance feels absurd. What is one day of discipline against years of confusion? What is one page against the book, one workout against the body, 1 hour against the future, one quiet act of self-control against a life full of old habits? The mind wants visible proof. It wants something immediate enough to reassure you that the effort is working. And when that proof does not arrive quickly, discouragement begins to whisper that maybe this is not enough. But life changes in ways that are often too gradual to impress you while they are happening. That is the hard part. Real change usually does not announce itself. It accumulates silently. It happens in the hidden arithmetic of repetition, where one small action means very little on its own, and almost everything when it is done again and again and again. What looks weak in isolation starts becoming powerful through continuity. The action does not need to feel big. It needs to stay alive long enough to gather weight. This is one of the deepest truths about growth that people resist because it asks for patience before reward. Aristotle, in a way that has echoed through centuries, said that we are what we repeatedly do. The line is familiar because it sounds wise, but it only becomes real when you begin to see how much of your life is not built by what you intend once, but by what you return to consistently. A single action may express desire. Repetition reveals identity, and identity, over time, shapes everything. That is why small actions matter so much more than they seem to in the beginning. A person doesn't become focused in one day. They become focused by repeatedly returning their attention instead of scattering it. A person doesn't become strong because one day they felt intense enough to act. They become strong because they kept doing what mattered after the feeling faded. Even trust in yourself is built this way, not through one vow, one realization, one emotional turning point, but through the repeated experience of watching yourself follow through in small ways. Each small action becomes a quiet vote for the kind of life you are building, and that vote matters even when the result is still invisible. This is where many people become impatient with reality. They are willing to act, but only if they can see enough progress to stay emotionally encouraged. They want the effort to feel meaningful right away. They want the future to send reassurance back into the present. But often, the present offers no such comfort. It asks you to do the ordinary thing again without applause, without certainty, without the emotional high that made it feel important the first time. That is where consistency begins separating itself from intensity. Intensity wants to feel the transformation immediately. Consistency is willing to let transformation arrive quietly. And the people who understand this begin moving through life very differently. They stop asking whether today's effort looks impressive in isolation. They start asking whether it belongs to a pattern they are willing to trust. They stop treating the small act like it has to prove everything at once. They let it remain what it is, one piece of a much larger architecture. That shift is subtle, but it changes the emotional burden of growth. You no longer need every day to feel extraordinary. You only need the day to continue the pattern. And once that becomes your standard, progress starts looking less dramatic and more dependable, less like a performance, more like construction. This is also why people often fail to recognize when a life is changing until much later. The daily action looked too small to matter, but the months passed, the years passed, the identity changed. What once required effort became rhythm. What once felt impossible became baseline. And when they finally looked back, the distance between who they were and who they had become was too large to ignore. Not because one heroic day changed everything, because the ordinary day kept returning. So maybe the practice here is to stop insulting small effort simply because it does not flatter your impatience. The next time the action in front of you feels too minor to matter, too repetitive to feel inspiring, too ordinary to seem transformative, it may help to remember that life is often shaped by what continues, not by what impresses. The smallest action, when it survives long enough, begins gathering a force that intensity alone can never hold. Because in the end, the things that change a life rarely look powerful while they are still small. They only reveal their power later, after they have been repeated enough times to become impossible to ignore. You stop depending on motivation to move. One of the quietest traps in self-improvement is the belief that you need to feel ready in order to act well. You wait for the right state, the right energy, the right internal weather. You tell yourself that when motivation returns, you'll become consistent again. You'll focus again. You'll do what you know matters. But the longer you live this way, the more unstable your life becomes. Because motivation is persuasive, but it is not dependable. It visits, it lifts you, it makes everything feel possible for a while. Then it leaves, often without warning, and you are left staring at the same work, the same habits, the same responsibilities, but without the emotional force that made them feel exciting before. That is the moment most people stop. Not because the goal became less important, but because the feeling that carried them there is no longer present. And if you build your life around that feeling, your progress becomes tied to something that has never promised to stay. That is why consistency matters so deeply. It breaks the hidden dependence on motivation by teaching you to move before the feeling arrives, after it leaves, and sometimes without it ever showing up at all. This is not a glamorous shift. In fact, it can feel almost disappointing at first, because part of the fantasy of change is the hope that one day you will become the kind of person who always feels like doing what matters, that the resistance will disappear, that discipline will become easy because your inner state will finally match your intentions every day. But real growth usually asks for something much less romantic than that. It asks whether you can keep your word to yourself on ordinary days. Days when your mind feels dull. Days when life feels repetitive. Days when there is no emotional reward in the moment. That is where consistency starts becoming something more powerful than motivation ever was. It no longer asks, "Do you feel inspired enough to begin?" It asks something steadier. Are you willing to continue? That question changes the whole structure of your life. Because once you stop waiting to feel moved, you begin discovering that movement itself can create what feeling could not. You act first, and the emotional state begins to follow instead of lead. The mind settles once the body enters motion. The resistance weakens once the rhythm has started. The task that looked impossible from a distance becomes manageable once you are inside it. In this way, consistency teaches you a deeper truth. Action is often what creates readiness, not the other way around. There is a quiet philosophical dignity in that. The Stoics understood this well. They did not build their ethics around mood. They built them around practice. What mattered was not whether the day felt emotionally ideal, but whether you remained aligned with what was right and necessary, even when the inner climate was less cooperative. In that sense, consistency is not only practical, it is moral in the deepest personal sense. It is the repeated refusal to let temporary feeling become the ruler of permanent direction. And that refusal creates freedom. Because dependence on motivation is still a form of dependence. It means your future is always waiting for permission from your present mood. Your goals keep having to negotiate with how inspired you happen to feel that day. Your discipline becomes conditional. Your effort becomes emotional instead of structural. And once that happens, you are no longer building a life. You are chasing a state. Consistency puts an end to that chase. It says the day can feel flat and still count. The effort can feel ordinary and still matter. The action can happen even when the mood does not cooperate. That is the beginning of a much more stable relationship with work, growth, and self-respect. You stop treating productivity like something that should always feel emotionally supported. You begin accepting that some of the most important things in life will often be built in states that feel unremarkable, inconvenient, or resistant. And paradoxically, That acceptance makes the process lighter, because now you do not need to keep asking yourself whether you are in the right mood to begin. You do not need to keep diagnosing your motivation before you move. You stop making every day prove that you are inspired enough to deserve progress. You simply continue, and that continuity starts doing something motivation never could. It gives your life weight, structure, predictability, trust. So maybe the real gift of consistency is not only that it helps you get more done, maybe it helps you stop living at the mercy of emotional weather. The next time you feel that familiar pause, that subtle internal argument that says you'll do it when you feel more ready, more focused, more energized, it may help to remember that almost nobody builds a meaningful life by waiting for the right feeling to arrive first. They build it by acting often enough that feeling stops being the gatekeeper. Because in the end, motivation may begin the journey, but consistency is what teaches you how to keep walking when inspiration is no longer holding your hand. Consistency creates momentum you can trust. There is a moment in any meaningful effort where progress stops feeling like a push and starts feeling like movement. Not fast, not dramatic, but steady in a way that begins carrying you forward instead of asking you to force every step. That is momentum, and it is something most people never fully experience, not because they are incapable of it, but because they interrupt it too often. They move, then stop, start, then pause, build a rhythm, then break it. And each time that happens, they are not only pausing progress, they are resetting the very thing that would have made progress easier. Because momentum does not come from effort alone. It comes from continuity. In the beginning, everything feels heavy. Every action requires decision, effort, resistance, negotiation. You have to convince yourself to begin. You have to push through the friction. You have to create movement manually, step by step. And this is where most people misunderstand what they are experiencing. They assume that this difficulty means something is wrong, that the path is too hard, that they lack discipline, that they are not built for this. But what they are really feeling is the absence of momentum. A body at rest resists movement. A mind out of rhythm resists focus. And a life that keeps restarting never builds enough continuity to make things feel natural. So every attempt feels like the first attempt, even when it is not. Consistency changes that. When you begin showing up repeatedly, even in small ways, something starts forming beneath the surface. The action becomes less foreign. The resistance becomes more predictable. The decision-making becomes lighter. You no longer need to negotiate with yourself from zero every day, because part of the movement has already been established. And slowly, almost quietly, the effort begins to feel different. You still work, you still choose, you still show up. But you are no longer starting from stillness. You are continuing something that is already in motion. That is the point where momentum begins to carry part of the weight. And this is where trust enters the picture. Because once you experience momentum clearly, even for a short time, something inside you changes. You realize that you do not need to rebuild everything every day, that there is a version of progress that does not depend on intensity, but on continuity, that there is a rhythm you can enter that makes things feel less forced and more natural. You begin trusting the process, not in a blind way, but in an experienced way. You have felt what happens when you keep going long enough for things to connect. You have seen how small actions begin linking together into something larger. You have noticed how the work becomes more familiar, how the mind resists less, how the effort becomes less chaotic and more structured. That trust is powerful because it removes a certain kind of doubt that often stops people early. The doubt that says, this isn't working, this isn't enough, this is too slow. When you understand momentum, you stop expecting immediate proof. You know that the first stage will feel heavier. You know that clarity comes after continuity. You know that ease is often the result of repetition, not the condition for it. And that understanding allows you to stay longer, to continue past the point where most people stop. There is also something else that begins to happen once momentum is established. You become less fragile, not emotionally, but structurally. A missed day does not collapse everything. A moment of distraction does not erase your direction. You no longer feel like you are one mistake away from losing all progress, because your progress is no longer built on isolated efforts. It is built on a pattern that has weight, and patterns with weight are harder to break. This is why consistency is often described as quiet power. It does not look impressive in the beginning. It does not create immediate excitement, but over time it builds something far more valuable than intensity ever could. It builds movement that sustains itself. So maybe the shift here is not about trying to push harder every day. Maybe it is about staying long enough to let movement begin. The next time you feel like stopping, like what you're doing is too small, too repetitive, too slow to matter, it may help to remember that momentum is not something you start with. It is something you earn by continuing past the stage where everything still feels heavy. Because once you reach it, something changes. You are no longer trying to force progress into existence. You are part of something that is already moving, and that is a very different place to build from. It makes hard things feel less overwhelming. There is a certain kind of weight that appears the moment you look at something as a whole, a goal, a change, a responsibility, a version of your life that feels far away from where you are now. When you hold all of it in your mind at once, it can feel too large to approach. Too many steps, too much time, too much effort, and the mind, almost automatically, starts turning that size into resistance. Not because you are incapable, but because you are trying to face everything at once. That is where overwhelm begins. It is not always a result of difficulty itself. It is often a result of scale. You are not reacting to the next step. You are reacting to the entire path. And when the entire path feels too big, your system hesitates. It delays. It distracts itself. It looks for something smaller, easier, more immediately manageable. And this is where inconsistency makes things worse. Because every time you stop and restart, the weight returns in its full form. You never stay with the process long enough for it to shrink into manageable parts. Each attempt feels like the beginning again. The full distance is always in front of you, untouched, unbroken, unapproached. So the mind keeps seeing the mountain. Consistency changes how you experience that mountain. It does not remove the difficulty. It changes your relationship with it. When you show up regularly, something subtle begins to happen. The large, overwhelming thing starts breaking into smaller, familiar pieces. You are no longer thinking about everything at once. You are thinking about what is in front of you today. The next step, the next action, the next unit of effort that you have already begun to recognize. The mountain does not disappear, but it stops looking like one continuous wall. It becomes a series of steps you have already started climbing. This is where the feeling of overwhelm begins to fade. Not because the task became easier overnight, but because your mind is no longer trying to carry the full weight of it at once. You are inside the process now, and once you are inside something, It feels very different than when you are standing outside it imagining everything at once. That difference is powerful because the mind tends to exaggerate what it has not entered yet. It builds tension around what is still abstract. It creates fear around what is still undefined. But once you begin engaging with the reality of the task in small, repeated ways, the unknown becomes known. The large becomes segmented. The intimidating becomes familiar. And familiarity reduces fear. There is a quiet wisdom in this that has been understood for a long time. Lao Tzu once said that a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. But what is often missed in that idea is not just the beginning, it is the continuation. Because one step reduces distance slightly, but repeated steps change how distance is experienced altogether. You stop measuring how far you have to go, and you start living inside the act of moving. And once that shift happens, overwhelm loses its grip. You are no longer standing still, staring at the full scale of what lies ahead. You are already in motion. This also changes how you approach difficulty itself. Hard things stop feeling like singular, heavy events that require a huge amount of energy all at once. They become processes you can return to, patterns you can continue, something you chip away at instead of something you have to conquer in one moment of intensity. That makes the entire experience more sustainable. You stop needing to feel strong enough to handle everything today. You only need to be steady enough to handle what is in front of you now. And when that becomes your focus, something interesting happens. You become more consistent, precisely because things feel less overwhelming. And things feel less overwhelming because you are more consistent. The two begin reinforcing each other. So maybe the real shift here is not about making hard things easy. It is about making them approachable. The next time something in your life feels too big, too distant, too demanding to face, it may help to stop looking at it as a whole, not as something you have to solve completely, but as something you can enter gradually. One action at a time, one return at a time, one continuation at a time. Because overwhelm thrives when you try to carry everything at once. Consistency dissolves it by teaching you to carry only what belongs to this moment. And over time, that is more than enough to move through even the hardest things. You create steady progress instead of emotional cycles. A lot of people are not lacking effort, they are lacking continuity. They try hard, they care deeply, they have moments of intense clarity where everything feels possible. They make plans, set standards, promise themselves that this time they will do it differently, and for a while they mean it. They act on it. They move. They feel almost transformed by the force of that beginning. Then the cycle starts again. A difficult day comes. The energy drops. Something interrupts the rhythm. The emotional force that made the effort feel natural begins fading, and with it goes the behavior. Progress slows, then stops. Guilt enters. Frustration follows. After some time, another wave of motivation appears, and the whole thing begins again from the top. This is what emotional cycles do. They create the illusion of movement without the security of direction. You are always beginning, always reawakening, always having another "this is the moment everything changes" experience. But because the pattern depends too heavily on feeling, the progress itself becomes unstable. It rises with emotion and collapses with emotion. And after enough repetitions, a person starts living with a strange kind of fatigue. Not the fatigue of hard work, the fatigue of never fully building on what came before. That is where consistency becomes quietly revolutionary, Because consistency takes progress out of the hands of emotional intensity and places it inside rhythm. It no longer asks whether you feel inspired enough to continue. It simply keeps the line moving. The day may feel flat. The effort may feel ordinary. Your mood may not cooperate. But the action still happens, and because it still happens, the life you are building remains in motion even when your emotions are not helping you carry it. This changes the emotional structure of progress itself. You stop living in waves. You stop needing every week to feel powerful in order for the work to matter. You stop measuring growth by how inspired you were while doing it. Instead, you begin noticing something subtler and much more stable. There is movement even when you do not feel dramatic. There is progress even when the day feels unremarkable. There is a line connecting yesterday to today and today to tomorrow, and that line gives your life a kind of steadiness that emotional cycles never could. That steadiness matters more than people realize, because emotional cycles are exhausting not only because they interrupt progress, but because they keep destabilizing your relationship with yourself. Every rise creates hope. Every collapse creates disappointment. Every restart asks you to believe again after you have already seen yourself stop before. A person can begin to feel as though they are always trying, always caring, always recommitting, yet somehow never fully trusting the process. Consistency starts repairing that distrust. It tells your mind something new. That effort does not have to come packaged as intensity in order to count. That movement does not have to feel dramatic in order to be real. That change can be quieter than your emotions would prefer, and still far more effective than anything built on emotional surges. There is a philosophical calm in that realization. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." The line cuts through a familiar trap, the trap of staying in emotional and mental preparation rather than settling into repeated action. Consistency is one of the purest expressions of that Stoic spirit. Less emotional ceremony, more return, less fascination with the feeling of progress, more devotion to the practice of it. And the longer you live this way, the more your life begins to feel less chaotic inwardly. You stop feeling as though your future depends on whether the next wave of motivation arrives in time. You stop treating yourself like someone who must always be emotionally convinced before acting. You build a steadier floor beneath your life, one that can hold even when your mood changes, when your energy dips, when your enthusiasm is nowhere to be found. That is what emotional cycles can never give you. They can give intensity. They can give temporary hope. They can even give memorable beginnings. But they cannot give you the quiet relief of knowing that your progress does not disappear every time your feelings change. Consistency can. So maybe the shift here is not about becoming more emotionally powerful. Maybe it is about no longer allowing your emotions to decide whether your effort gets to continue. The next time you feel yourself wanting the old dramatic beginning, the old rush, the old feeling that this time it will be different, because you feel different, it may help to remember that the life you want is rarely built in those emotional peaks. It is built in what continues after the feeling fades. Because in the end, steady progress may look less exciting than emotional cycles, but it is the only one that keeps taking you somewhere real. You stop starting over again and again. There is a particular kind of frustration that comes not from failure, but from repetition. Not repetition of effort, but repetition of beginnings. You decide to change something. You start. You move for a while. Then something breaks the rhythm, and suddenly you are back at the same point again, not because you forgot what to do, and not because you lost the desire, but because the continuity that would have carried you forward is no longer there. And without continuity, everything resets. The habit weakens, the progress fades, the identity dissolves back into possibility instead of reality. So the next time you try, it feels like starting again. This is one of the most exhausting cycles a person can live inside, because it creates a strange contradiction. You know how to begin. In fact, you may be very good at beginning. You understand what needs to be done. You can even generate the energy to take action. But none of that translates into lasting change, because what is missing is not knowledge or intention. It is continuity. And without continuity, effort loses its memory. That is the part most people never fully see. Every time you stay consistent, you are not only making progress, you are preserving it. You are allowing yesterday's effort to still exist inside today. You are building something that remains instead of something that disappears the moment you pause. But when consistency breaks repeatedly, that preservation never happens. The work never accumulates long enough to become stable. It keeps dissolving back into starting points. So your life begins to feel like a series of attempts instead of a structure. That is why consistency changes so much more than the outcome. It changes your experience of time itself. You stop living in fragments. You stop dividing your life into disconnected attempts, separated by gaps of inaction. Instead, you begin to feel a continuous line running through your days. What you did yesterday still matters today. What you do today will still matter tomorrow. There is a sense of ongoing construction instead of repeated demolition. And that sense is deeply stabilizing, because one of the reasons people lose confidence in themselves is not that they cannot act. It is that they have seen themselves restart too many times. Each restart quietly tells the mind something dangerous, that your effort is temporary, that your discipline cannot be trusted to last, that your intentions do not carry forward beyond a certain point. Over time, that becomes internal doubt, not loud, but persistent. You hesitate to fully commit because part of you expects the pattern to break again. You start protecting yourself from disappointment by lowering expectations. You begin to question whether this will really be different, even before you have given it the chance to become something real. Consistency begins repairing that damage. Each day you continue, you are sending a different message inward, not through words, but through evidence. You are showing yourself that this time is not another isolated beginning, that this is part of a pattern that holds, that your effort is not something that appears and disappears, but something that can remain. And the longer that pattern continues, the more something inside you relaxes. You stop anticipating collapse. You stop assuming you will have to restart again. You begin trusting the line you are building. This is where consistency becomes more than productivity. It becomes self-respect. Not in the sense of feeling good about yourself in a moment, but in the deeper sense of being able to rely on your own continuity. Knowing that what you start does not immediately become fragile, that your actions have a kind of durability, that your effort does not vanish the moment life becomes slightly inconvenient. There is a quiet strength in that, because a person who no longer lives in constant restart has something most people are still searching for: stability, not perfect discipline, not flawless execution, but a life that moves forward without needing to constantly rebuild itself from the ground up. So maybe the shift here is not about starting better. Maybe it is about stopping less. The next time you feel that familiar break in rhythm, that moment where it would be easy to pause and tell yourself you will return later, it may help to remember that what you are protecting is not just today's effort. You are protecting continuity itself. Because every time you keep going, even in a small way, you are doing something far more valuable than making progress. You are preventing another beginning. And over time, that is what allows your life to finally feel like it is moving forward, instead of repeating itself. Consistency makes discipline easier to maintain. At the beginning, discipline feels like effort. You have to push yourself, remind yourself, negotiate with resistance. Every action feels like a decision you must win. Every step requires energy. And because of that, discipline is often experienced as something heavy, something that demands strength every single time you show up. That is why many people believe discipline is hard by nature. But what they are really experiencing is the early stage, before consistency has had time to change the structure of the effort. Because discipline is not meant to stay difficult forever. When something becomes consistent, something subtle begins to shift. The action starts becoming familiar. The resistance becomes predictable. The internal argument loses some of its intensity. You no longer have to convince yourself in the same way, because part of you has already accepted that this is what happens now. The effort is still there, but it is no longer new, and that changes everything. Because the hardest part of discipline is not the action itself, it is the decision. The moment where you are still outside the behavior, still thinking about it, still weighing whether you feel like doing it or not. That is where resistance is strongest. That is where excuses feel most convincing. That is where delay becomes easy. Consistency reduces that space. The more often you repeat an action, the less room there is between intention and execution. You stop overthinking it. You stop treating it as something optional. You begin moving into it more automatically, not in a careless way, but in a way that reflects familiarity. It becomes part of your rhythm, and once something becomes part of your rhythm, discipline feels very different. You no longer wake up asking, "Should I do this today?" You already know the answer. The energy that used to go into deciding now goes into continuing. And that is a much lighter burden. Because decision fatigue is one of the biggest reasons people struggle to stay disciplined. Not the action itself, but the repeated negotiation before the action. Should I do it now or later? Do I feel ready enough? Maybe I'll skip today and return tomorrow. Each of these small questions drains energy. Consistency removes many of them, not by forcing you, but by simplifying your relationship with the behavior. You stop treating it like something you have to earn through motivation or justify through mood. It becomes something you do because it belongs to the pattern you are maintaining. This is where discipline begins to feel less like force and more like structure. There is a quiet philosophical clarity in this idea. William James once said that all our life, so far as it has definite form, is but a mass of habits. And habits, when built through consistency, remove the need for constant strength. They carry you. They reduce friction. They turn what once required effort into something that feels natural enough to continue. And that is the point many people never reach, because they stop too early. They experience discipline only in its heaviest form, when everything still requires effort, and they assume that is how it will always feel. They never stay long enough for the action to become familiar, for the resistance to weaken, for the decision to become easier. So they keep starting and stopping and starting again. And each time they return to the hardest stage. Consistency breaks that cycle. It allows you to move past the stage where discipline feels like constant struggle and into the stage where it begins supporting you instead of exhausting you. The behavior is no longer foreign. The effort is no longer new. The pattern is already in motion. And because of that, maintaining it becomes easier than rebuilding it. That is an important shift, because most people think discipline is about becoming stronger, but often it's about making things easier to continue. So maybe the goal is not to force yourself harder every day. Maybe it is to stay long enough for the process to carry you. The next time discipline feels heavy, it may help to remember that what you are experiencing is not the final form of it. It is the beginning, the stage where everything still requires effort, because nothing has been repeated long enough to become familiar. And if you continue past that stage, something changes. You stop relying on strength alone, and you start relying on rhythm. And rhythm is much easier to live with than constant force. Consistency reduces self-sabotage. Self-sabotage is often spoken about as if it were some hidden urge to ruin your own life. But most of the time it is not that dramatic. It is quieter, more ordinary, and much easier to live inside without naming it clearly. It appears in hesitation, in delay, in the small moment where you know what matters, but something in you turns away from it anyway. Not because you want to fail, but because inconsistency creates too much room for moods, fears, and temporary discomfort to keep interrupting what you already know you need to do. That is where a great deal of self-sabotage actually lives. Not in one terrible choice, but in the repeated gap between intention and follow-through. You want the change. You can even imagine the life it would create. But if your actions remain irregular, then every day becomes a new negotiation. And that negotiation is where self-sabotage finds its opening. Doubt enters. Resistance becomes persuasive. You start listening to the version of yourself that only exists in temporary states. The tired version, the avoidant version, the uncertain version, the one that wants relief more than alignment. And because nothing is stable yet, that version gets more influence than it should. This is why inconsistency is so dangerous psychologically. It keeps you exposed. It keeps your progress fragile enough that almost any passing mood can interrupt it. The structure is too weak to protect you from yourself. So, you do not need an enemy, a crisis, or some dramatic failure to lose momentum. A slight dip in energy can do it. A little self-doubt can do it. One emotionally off day can do it. The path keeps breaking not because you lack desire, but because there is not enough continuity to hold the line when your weaker moments arrive. Consistency changes that. It does not remove your difficult moods. It reduces how much authority they have. That is a very important difference. You may still wake up feeling resistant. You may still have days where avoidance feels seductive, where the old stories return, where comfort seems more reasonable than effort. But when a pattern is already in place, those states no longer get to decide everything. They still speak, but they are speaking into structure, and structure is much harder to derail than intention alone. This is where consistency becomes a form of protection. It protects you from the unstable parts of yourself that only become powerful when nothing steady is already in motion. It shortens the argument between what you know and what you feel. It reduces the number of openings where fear, laziness, perfectionism, discouragement, or temporary emotional heaviness can redirect your life. And over time, that changes your relationship with your own mind. You stop feeling like you are constantly betraying yourself in small ways. You stop watching yourself drift from what matters every time the emotional tone of the day changes. You begin to notice that the version of you who once kept interrupting the process is losing influence, not because they vanished, but because they no longer have enough empty space to take over. There is something deeply healing about that. Because self-sabotage creates a particular kind of pain. It is not only that progress slows, it is that you keep watching yourself become the obstacle. You know what matters, and still you step away from it. You make promises and break them. You build momentum and interrupt it. After enough repetition, the damage is not only practical, it becomes personal. You begin doubting your own sincerity. You stop trusting the part of you that says this matters, because you have seen how easily another part can undo it. Consistency begins repairing that fracture. It creates evidence that your better intentions are no longer helpless against your temporary states. It shows you that a low mood does not have to become a broken pattern. That discomfort does not have to become avoidance. That the part of you trying to build something real can finally become stronger than the part of you that keeps reaching for escape. This is where a subtle philosophical truth comes in. The Stoics understood that freedom was not merely freedom from outside interference, but from inner slavery. And self-sabotage is one of the clearest examples of inner slavery there is. It is the condition of being repeatedly ruled by what is lower, weaker, more impulsive, more temporary. Consistency is one way of resisting that rule. It is the repeated act of standing by what is better in you long enough for it to become stronger than what keeps trying to interrupt it. So maybe the next time you notice that familiar impulse to delay, to drift, to step away from what you already know matters, you do not treat it like some mysterious flaw in your character. You see it more clearly, not as fate, but as an opening that becomes smaller every time you keep the pattern alive, every time you continue instead of renegotiate, every time you act before the weaker voice has time to become the loudest one in the room. Because in the end, self-sabotage depends on instability, and consistency, quietly and repeatedly, takes that instability away. You rebuild trust in your own word. There is a quiet kind of damage that happens when you repeatedly tell yourself you will do something and then don't. It doesn't always feel dramatic in the moment. You delay, you adjust. You tell yourself you'll start tomorrow or later or when things feel better. Each individual moment feels small, almost harmless. But over time, those moments begin to accumulate into something deeper. A loss of trust. Not in other people, in yourself. You start noticing it in subtle ways. You hesitate when making commitments to your own goals. You feel a gap between what you say and what you believe will actually happen. You plan, but part of you doesn't fully expect yourself to follow through. There's a quiet doubt that sits beneath your intentions, not loud enough to stop you completely, but strong enough to weaken your confidence before you even begin. That is what broken self-trust feels like, and it is one of the most underestimated problems in personal growth. Because when you don't trust your own word, everything becomes harder. Discipline feels heavier, motivation fades faster, goals feel less real. Not because they are impossible, but because your mind has learned that your promises are temporary, that your intentions don't always translate into action, that the version of you who decides is not always the version of you who follows through. Consistency begins repairing that fracture, not through big declarations, not through emotional commitment, but through something much quieter. Repetition, the simple act of doing what you said you would do, again and again, even in small ways. Each time you follow through, something shifts internally. You may not feel it immediately, but your mind is registering it. You said it, and you did it. That matters more than people realize, because trust is not built through intensity. It is built through reliability, and reliability comes from consistency. When your actions begin aligning with your words on a regular basis, Your mind starts updating its expectations. It stops treating your promises as temporary. It begins to believe that when you decide something, it is likely to happen. That belief changes how you move through everything. You start taking your own decisions more seriously. You feel less internal resistance when you commit to something because there is less doubt underneath it. You no longer need to rely on external pressure or emotional peaks to get things done. There is a growing sense that your word carries weight, and that weight becomes part of your identity. This is where something deeper begins to form. Self-respect. Not the kind that comes from external validation or momentary success, but the kind that grows from watching yourself act with integrity over time. From knowing that you are someone who can be relied on, not just by others, but by yourself. That when you say you will show up, you do. That when you decide something matters, you act accordingly. There is a quiet power in that, because many people underestimate how much of their confidence depends on this internal trust. They look for confidence in results, in achievements, in recognition. But often, the real foundation of confidence is much simpler. It is the belief that you can count on yourself. Consistency builds that belief, and once it begins to solidify, something changes in how you experience effort. You no longer feel like you are constantly fighting yourself. You are working with yourself. The gap between intention and action becomes smaller. The internal conversation becomes quieter. You spend less time convincing and more time doing. There is also a philosophical depth to this idea. Friedrich Nietzsche once said that what matters most is that a person becomes what they promise themselves to be. That statement points to something essential. Your relationship with yourself is not defined by what you hope or what you imagine, but by what you repeatedly prove. Consistency is that proof. So maybe the shift here is not about aiming for perfection. It is about becoming reliable. The next time you set a small intention, something simple, something manageable, and you follow through on it, you are doing more than completing a task. You are rebuilding something that may have been weakened over time. You are showing yourself that your word is not just an idea. It is something that can be trusted again. And over time, that trust becomes one of the strongest foundations you can build your life on. Progress stops feeling random. One of the most frustrating feelings in life is the sense that your progress is inconsistent in a way you can't fully explain. Some days feel productive, clear, focused. You move forward, you feel aligned, you believe you're finally building something real. Then other days feel completely different, scattered, slow, uncertain, as if everything you built has somehow slipped out of your hands without a clear reason. And over time, this creates a quiet instability. You begin to feel like your progress is unpredictable, like it depends on something you can't control: your mood, your energy, your environment, your timing. You start asking yourself why some days work and others don't, and the lack of a clear answer makes everything feel less reliable. That's what inconsistency does. It turns your progress into something that feels random, because when your effort is irregular, your results become irregular. There is no steady input to produce a steady output, so your life starts reflecting that pattern. Movement, then pause. Clarity, then confusion. Growth, then stagnation. And since there's no consistent structure underneath it, everything begins to feel like chance. Consistency removes that randomness, not by making every day perfect, but by making every day connected. When you act consistently, even at a small scale, something begins to stabilize. Your progress stops being tied to how the day feels and starts being tied to what you actually do. And because what you do is no longer changing unpredictably, the results begin to follow a more stable pattern. This changes your perception of your own life. You stop wondering whether things are working. You start seeing that they are. Not dramatically at first, but clearly enough to recognize that movement is happening. The effort is accumulating. The direction is holding. There is a line forming, and that line makes your progress feel less like a series of isolated events and more like a process you can understand and trust. That trust matters, because when progress feels random, motivation becomes fragile. You start doubting the process. You question whether what you're doing is effective. You look for shortcuts, new strategies, different approaches, hoping to find something that will make things more predictable. But often, the problem is not the method, it's the inconsistency. Once you remove that, everything begins to make more sense. You start noticing how effort translates into results over time. You see how small improvements add up. You understand how certain actions lead to certain outcomes. The process becomes visible instead of confusing, and that visibility creates confidence. Not emotional confidence, but structural confidence, the kind that comes from understanding cause and effect in your own life. You begin to feel that if you continue, things will continue to move, that if you show up, something will happen. Not instantly, not perfectly, but predictably enough to trust. This is where consistency becomes more than a habit. It becomes clarity. There's a quiet philosophical truth here. The ancient Stoics believed that while we cannot control outcomes, we can control our actions. And when those actions are steady, something remarkable happens. Even though the world remains uncertain, your direction becomes certain. You stop depending on luck, timing, or mood to move forward. You begin creating your own form of predictability through repetition, and that predictability reduces anxiety, because uncertainty is one of the biggest sources of stress. Not knowing whether your effort will lead anywhere, not knowing if you're on the right path, not knowing if today will undo yesterday. But when your actions become consistent, that uncertainty begins to shrink. You may not control everything, but you control enough to feel grounded. So maybe the shift here is not about making faster progress. It's about making understandable progress. The next time you feel like things are not working, like your effort isn't leading anywhere, it may help to look not at the results first, but at the pattern. Is there continuity? Is there repetition? Is there something stable underneath the effort? Because once there is, something changes. Your life stops feeling like a series of random outcomes and starts feeling like something you are actually building. Repetition turns effort into identity. In the beginning, effort still feels separate from you. You do the work, but it still feels like something you're trying to do, not something that fully belongs to who you are. You show up, but there is still a gap between the action and the self. A gap that says, this is something I'm practicing, something I'm attempting, something I'm trying to become better at. That gap is normal, but it is also the reason many people stay fragile in the early stages of change. Because if effort remains only effort, it can always feel temporary. It can still feel optional. It can still feel like something you do when conditions are favorable, when your mood supports it, when the day feels emotionally aligned enough for you to act like the person you want to become. Repetition changes that. Not all at once, and not in a way that is always visible while it is happening. But over time, repeated action begins crossing a threshold. What you once had to force becomes something you return to more naturally. What once felt like discipline begins feeling closer to character. The action no longer sits outside you as a project. It starts becoming part of how you know yourself. That is when effort begins turning into identity. This matters because identity is one of the most powerful forces in human behavior. People can break a plan, they can abandon a goal, they can drift away from an intention, but they struggle much more to act against who they believe they are. Once something becomes part of your identity, consistency no longer depends on persuasion in the same way. You do not have to keep convincing yourself from zero. You are now acting in accordance with a self-image that has been built through repetition. And self-image built through evidence is much stronger than self-image built through hope. This is where many people go wrong. They try to change identity through declarations. They say, "I am disciplined now. I am focused now. I am the kind of person who follows through." But if those statements are not supported by repeated action, the mind does not fully believe them. It may want to, but it knows the difference between aspiration and proof. Repetition provides the proof. Every time you continue, you strengthen the case. Not only that you can do the action, but that the action belongs to you. The writer writes, "The disciplined person returns. The focused person protects attention. The consistent person does not need every day to feel special in order to remain in motion." And after enough repetition, these are no longer motivational ideas. They are descriptions. That is a profound shift. Because once repetition starts shaping identity, your relationship with effort changes completely. You are no longer asking, "Can I make myself do this today?" You are asking something much quieter. Is this in alignment with the person I've been becoming through what I repeatedly do? That question is far more stable than mood. It reaches deeper than motivation. It roots action in selfhood. There is a philosophical weight to this that goes far beyond productivity. William James understood that human beings are shaped by habitual action, and Aristotle, long before him, saw virtue as something practiced into being. Not a feeling, not an abstraction, but a repeated embodiment. You do not become something because you admired it once. You become it because you lived it enough times that it began organizing your character from within. Consistency is how that organization happens, and when it does, something powerful becomes possible. You stop experiencing every act of discipline as a contest between who you are and what you must force yourself to do. The contest softens, the action fits more cleanly. There is less internal resistance because there is less internal contradiction. You are not dragging yourself toward a standard that feels foreign. You are expressing a standard that has started becoming your own. This also means that inconsistency becomes more costly than it once was, not because you become perfectionistic, but because you can feel more clearly when your actions no longer match the identity you have worked to build. The standard is no longer external. It lives closer to the center of you. And because of that, returning becomes easier too. You know where you belong. You know the rhythm. You know the version of yourself you are trying to remain loyal to. So maybe the deeper value of consistency is not only that it helps you get results. Maybe it helps you become someone more coherent, someone whose actions and self-understanding no longer feel so far apart, someone who does not have to keep beginning from a fantasy of who they hope to be, because repetition has slowly turned that hope into evidence. Because in the end, effort changes a life most powerfully, not when it feels intense, but when it has been repeated long enough to become part of who you are. Consistency protects your future from your moods. There is a version of you that exists in every mood. The focused version, the tired version, the disciplined version, the avoidant version, and each one feels convincing while you are inside it. When you feel clear, you make strong decisions. You set standards, you define what matters, you see your future in a way that feels grounded and true. But when your state shifts, something else happens. That clarity becomes less accessible. The same decisions feel heavier. The same goals feel less urgent. The same standards begin to soften under the weight of how you feel in that moment. And if your life depends too much on how you feel, then your life begins to shift with every change in mood. That is the hidden instability most people live with, not because they don't know what they want, but because they allow different emotional states to keep renegotiating what they already decided. One day you commit, another day you question it, another day you delay, another day you return. And over time, your direction becomes inconsistent, not because your goals changed, but because your moods were allowed to keep interfering with them. Consistency protects you from that, not by removing your moods, but by reducing their authority. When you act consistently, you are no longer asking your current emotional state for permission to continue. You are following a structure that was decided from a clearer place, a calmer place, a more stable version of yourself that saw the path with less distortion. This is one of the most intelligent things a person can do, to let their best thinking guide their actions, even when their current feeling disagrees. Because moods are temporary by nature. They rise and fall. They change with energy, sleep, stress, environment, and countless small variables. They are real, but they are not reliable as decision makers for long-term direction. If you keep adjusting your actions based on them, your future becomes unstable. Consistency creates separation. It separates who you are in this moment from the direction you have chosen across time. You may feel resistance today, but the action still happens. You may feel doubt, but the pattern continues. You may feel low energy, but the structure remains intact. And because of that, your life stops resetting every time your mood changes. There is a quiet discipline in this that goes beyond productivity. Epictetus once said that no man is free who is not master of himself. And one of the clearest ways to understand that is this. If your actions are constantly ruled by your emotional state, then you are not fully directing your life. You are being directed by something that was never meant to be in charge. Consistency begins restoring that direction. It allows your future to be shaped by your decisions, not by your fluctuations. And that changes how you experience difficult days. You stop expecting every day to feel supportive. You stop needing your mood to align perfectly with your goals. You begin accepting that some days will feel heavier, less clear, less motivated, and yet still be part of the same forward movement. This reduces a lot of internal conflict, because you are no longer arguing with yourself every time your mood changes. You are not asking, "Do I feel like doing this today?" as if that question determines everything. You already know the answer. The pattern continues. And once that becomes normal, something shifts. Your emotions lose some of their ability to interrupt your direction. They are still there. You still feel them, but they no longer decide for you. And that is where a deeper kind of stability begins, because your life is no longer built on emotional agreement. It is built on continuity. So maybe the shift here is not about controlling your moods. It is about protecting your future from them. The next time you feel that internal resistance, that subtle pull away from what you already decided matters, it may help to remember that your future does not depend on how you feel today. It depends on whether you continue. Because consistency is not only what moves you forward, it is what keeps your direction intact when your emotions try to change it. Consistency creates long-term inner stability. There is a kind of instability that has very little to do with what is happening around you, and everything to do with how often you keep breaking your own rhythm. You commit, then drift. You focus, then disappear. You build something, then let it weaken, then return to it again when the discomfort of being off track becomes too loud to ignore. And after enough cycles like that, something deeper begins to happen. Your life may still look functional from the outside, but inwardly there is too much interruption, too much starting and stopping, too much self-negotiation, too much emotional movement tied to whether you are currently on track or not. That kind of pattern creates inner instability, not because you are failing in some dramatic way, but because your nervous system never gets to settle into continuity. You are either feeling the pressure of needing to get back on track, or the fragile relief of having finally returned to it, but there is very little of the calmer middle ground where your life is simply moving forward in a stable way. Consistency creates that middle ground. It gives your inner world something your moods never can: rhythm. And rhythm has a stabilizing effect that goes far beyond productivity. When you act consistently, your days stop feeling so emotionally discontinuous. You're not constantly swinging between guilt and relief, avoidance and effort, intensity and collapse. There is a steadier line running through your life, and that line begins to affect the way you think, feel, and carry yourself. This matters because inner stability is built less by dramatic breakthroughs than by repeated coherence, by knowing what your day is anchored to, by not constantly surprising yourself with your own inconsistency, by no longer living in a cycle where your peace depends on whether you happen to be disciplined this week. When consistency becomes part of your life, your internal state begins to organize itself around something more reliable than emotion. Your mind becomes less scattered because it is not constantly recovering from disorder. Your self-respect becomes steadier because it is no longer based on occasional peaks of effort. Your confidence becomes quieter and more durable because it is tied to continuity rather than performance. This is why consistency can feel healing in a way people do not always expect. It reduces internal chaos. So much of the distress people carry is not only from external problems, it is from living in conflict with themselves, knowing what matters and not doing it, knowing what helps and not returning to it, repeatedly breaking patterns that they themselves need in order to feel whole, then wondering why life feels mentally noisy and emotionally unstable. Consistency softens that conflict. It brings your actions into closer alignment with what you already know is right for you. And that alignment has a calming effect. Not because life becomes easy, but because you are no longer constantly splitting yourself between intention and action. There is less inner argument, less self-betrayal in small daily moments, less of that exhausting experience of having to rebuild psychological order from scratch every few days. Over time, this becomes one of the strongest foundations for peace. Not the peace of perfect circumstances, but the peace of inner coherence. The peace that comes from living in a way that does not keep undoing itself. The peace of knowing that your life is being held together by something more dependable than inspiration, urgency, or temporary emotional force. There is also something quietly philosophical here. The ancient Stoics understood that a stable life is not built by occasional noble intentions, but by daily practice, by returning over and over to what forms character. In that sense, consistency is not merely a tool for getting results. It is a way of reducing inner disorder, a way of becoming less divided within yourself. And perhaps that is why it matters so much, because a person can survive inconsistency for a long time, but they rarely feel deeply settled inside it. Something in them remains tense, unresolved, half trusting, half doubting. But when consistency becomes real, not perfect, but real, the whole inner atmosphere begins to change. Life feels less chaotic because you are no longer contributing so much chaos to it from within. So maybe the deeper value of consistency is not only that it helps you achieve more, maybe it helps you become more internally stable. The next time you're tempted to think of consistency as something practical but emotionally dry, it may help to see what it is actually building beneath the surface. Not just habits, not just results, but a steadier relationship with yourself, a life with fewer internal collapses, a quieter mind, a stronger floor beneath your thoughts, your choices, and your days. Because in the long run, one of the greatest gifts consistency gives you is not intensity. It is the quiet relief of no longer feeling inwardly unstable all the time. You become dangerous in a world full of distractions. We're living in a time where attention is constantly under attack, not in an obvious dramatic way, but in a quiet, continuous one. Notifications, endless content, shifting priorities, emotional noise, the pressure to respond, react, consume, compare. Your focus is being pulled in small directions all day long, and over time, that pull becomes normal. You start getting used to interruption, used to switching, used to starting and stopping, used to never staying with something long enough for it to deepen. And in that environment, something subtle happens. Consistency becomes rare, not because it is difficult in theory, but because it requires something that the modern world is constantly eroding: sustained attention over time. The ability to return, again and again, to the same meaningful direction without being pulled away by everything that feels urgent but isn't important. That is why consistency becomes powerful in a different way today. It's no longer just a personal advantage, it's a form of resistance. Because while most people are being moved by distraction, reacting to whatever appears next, shifting focus based on stimulation instead of intention, a consistent person is doing something fundamentally different. They are staying with the work, staying with the process, staying with the direction long enough for something real to take shape. And that difference compounds. While others keep restarting, you continue. While others keep scattering, you deepen. While others keep reacting, you build. Over time, that creates a gap. Not an obvious one at first, but a real one. A gap in skill, in clarity, in self-trust, in results, in identity. Because consistency allows you to accumulate something that distraction constantly interrupts: depth. And depth is what makes someone dangerous in the best sense of the word. Not aggressive, not forceful, but difficult to compete with, difficult to stop, difficult to outgrow. Because when someone is able to stay with something long enough, they reach a level most people never touch. Not because they were more talented, but because they were less distracted. There is a quiet Nietzschean edge to this idea. He spoke often about the difference between those who are shaped by their environment and those who shape themselves despite it. In a world that constantly pulls your attention outward, consistency becomes a way of reclaiming your direction, of deciding what deserves your focus, and refusing to give that focus away too easily. That refusal is power. Because distraction doesn't destroy people all at once. It dilutes them. A little less focus here, a little less depth there, a little more scattered thinking, a little more fragmented effort. And after enough time, the life that could have been built never fully forms. Consistency protects you from that dilution. It keeps your attention anchored. It gives your effort direction. It allows your mind to stay with something long enough to understand it deeply, to improve within it, to build something that reflects sustained engagement instead of scattered attempts. And this is where things start becoming very different. You stop needing to constantly search for the next thing. You are already inside something that is growing. You are not reacting to the world's pace. You are moving at your own. And because of that, your progress becomes harder to interrupt. That's what makes you dangerous. You are not easy to pull away. You are not easy to distract. You are not easy to reset. You are building something that continues, while everything around you keeps stopping. So maybe the shift here is not about doing more. Maybe it's about protecting your direction. The next time you feel your attention being pulled, your focus breaking, your efforts scattering across too many things, it may help to remember that what you are protecting is not just time, it's depth. Because in a distracted world, the ability to stay consistent is no longer common, and what is not common becomes powerful. In the long run, consistency beats intensity every time. There is something seductive about intensity, the feeling of starting strong, the surge of energy, the sense that everything is finally aligning. In those moments, you don't just act, you feel transformed. You feel like this is it. This is the version of you that will finally carry everything forward. And for a while, that feeling can create real movement. You do more, push harder, stay focused longer than usual. But intensity has a limit, not because it isn't powerful, but because it isn't sustainable. It burns bright, then fades. And when it fades, if there's nothing steady underneath it, everything it built begins to weaken. The rhythm breaks. The effort becomes harder to maintain. The distance between action and inaction grows again. And slowly, almost predictably, the cycle returns. This is why so many people live in a pattern of strong beginnings, followed by quiet collapse. They rely on intensity to create change, but intensity was never designed to maintain it. Consistency is different. It doesn't feel as exciting. It doesn't give you the same emotional high. It doesn't make you feel transformed overnight. In fact, most of the time, it feels almost ordinary, repetitive, unremarkable. The kind of effort that doesn't attract attention or create immediate admiration, but it lasts. And that is what changes everything. Because in the long run, the person who continues will always outgrow the person who starts strong and stops. Not because they had more talent, more intelligence, or more opportunity, but because their efforts stayed alive long enough to compound. This is one of the simplest truths in life, and one of the hardest to accept emotionally. We want to believe that big moments create big change, but most of the time, it's the small moments that survive long enough that do. There is a quiet clarity in something Warren Buffett once said about wealth. It comes from doing simple things consistently over a long period of time. The same idea applies to almost everything: health, skill, focus, character, identity. None of these are built through occasional intensity. They are built through repeated, sustained action that doesn't collapse when the feeling changes. Consistency doesn't compete with intensity in the short term. It outlives it. That's the difference. Intensity can give you a powerful start. It can push you into motion. It can break inertia. But without consistency, it has nowhere to go. It rises, then disappears, leaving you with the memory of effort instead of the result of it. Consistency, on the other hand, doesn't need to feel powerful in the moment. It only needs to continue, and when it does, something almost inevitable begins to happen. The gap between you and others who rely on intensity starts widening. Not dramatically at first, but steadily. They surge, then pause. You move, then move again. They restart. You continue. And over time, that difference becomes too large to ignore. This is why consistency feels slow, until it doesn't. Until one day, the results are no longer small. The identity is no longer forming. The progress is no longer fragile. Everything that once felt distant has become part of your reality, not because of one defining moment, but because of thousands of ordinary ones that never stopped. And at that point, something becomes very clear. You didn't need to be at your best every day. You just needed to not disappear. So maybe the shift is this. Stop trying to win in moments. Start trying to remain. The next time you feel that pull toward intensity, that desire to go all in, to push hard, to prove something quickly, it may help to remember that what you are building is not a moment. It's a life. And a life is not shaped by how intensely you begin, but by how consistently you continue. Conclusion. At some point, the real question stops being whether you know what to do. Most people already know. They know the habit that would help, the work they should return to, the structure their life needs, the thing they keep postponing while waiting to feel different first. The harder question is whether they can remain with what matters long enough for it to change them. That is where consistency becomes more than a method. It becomes a way of living that refuses to hand your future over to mood, interruption, or temporary intensity. It is the choice to keep the line unbroken, even when the day feels ordinary, even when the reward is invisible, even when the version of you showing up does not feel impressive in the moment. And over time, that choice begins reshaping far more than your schedule or your output. It reshapes your relationship with yourself. You stop needing constant motivation to move. You stop restarting every few weeks. You stop living in emotional cycles that give you bursts of hope and then drop you back into frustration. Instead, something steadier begins to form. Trust, rhythm, momentum, a quieter identity built not from dramatic self-belief, but from repeated evidence. You become someone whose life is not constantly being renegotiated by how they feel on a given day. That changes the entire emotional atmosphere of growth. Progress stops feeling random because the pattern beneath it is no longer random. Discipline becomes easier because it is no longer being rebuilt from zero. Your mind becomes less scattered because your direction is no longer repeatedly interrupted. Even your inner life begins to settle because consistency reduces one of the most exhausting forms of instability there is, the instability of constantly breaking your own rhythm. There is something deeply human about this. We often imagine transformation as a breakthrough, a powerful realization, a strong beginning. But more often, transformation is quieter than that. It arrives through repetition, through the ordinary act of returning, through staying with what matters after the feeling that started it has already faded. Nietzsche wrote that all truly great things must first wear terrifying and monstrous masks in order to inscribe themselves on the hearts of humanity. In a much smaller, more personal way, consistency has its own mask. It often appears dull, repetitive, even unimpressive at first. But behind that mask is one of the most life-changing forces a person can build. Because consistency does not simply help you get results, it changes what kind of person you become while getting them. And maybe that is the part worth remembering when the process feels slow, when the action feels too small, when the day feels too ordinary to matter. The ordinary day counts. The repeated action counts. The quiet return counts. Not because each moment looks powerful on its own, but because a life is rarely shaped by what felt powerful once. It is shaped by what kept going. So maybe that is where this really lands. Not in the fantasy of becoming intense enough to change everything at once, but in the quieter decision to stop disappearing from your own path, to stop breaking the line, to stop asking every mood for permission, to keep placing one honest action after another until your life begins to reflect not the force of your best moments, but the reliability of your repeated ones. Because in the end, consistency is not glamorous. It is stronger than glamorous. It is what quietly turns effort into identity, direction into reality, and a scattered future into a life that finally begins to hold.